If you are launching a historic life-or-death mission to found an entirely new society, you don't rent a heavily used, battered, incredibly smelly cargo ship.
Right, you really don't.
I mean, you just wouldn't do it. It sounds like chartering a beat-up U-Haul truck with 250,000 miles on the odometer for a cross-country family road trip.
Yeah, a really terrible idea on paper.
Exactly. But in 1620, that is exactly what the separatists did. So welcome to a deep dive into a story you likely think you already know.
Keyword being think.
Right. We are talking to you directly today because we are unpacking the actual gritty reality of the Mayflower crossing. Because this isn't just a brief look at, a group of pilgrims in buckle hats having a harvest feast.
No, not at all.
We're exploring the complete life cycle of a hardworking, blue-collar English merchant vessel. We're looking at the desperate socio-political experiment that had to be invented on its wooden decks, and we are tracking how its specific legacy stretches all the way from the 17th century right into the modern era of artificial intelligence.
Which is, it's a wild trajectory when you really look at it, because the physical reality of that crossing completely dictates the historical outcome.
Right.
When you synthesize the maritime architectural analyses, the colonial heritage documents, and, importantly, the indigenous historical accounts from exhibits like Plymouth 400, well, a very different picture emerges.
A much darker picture, really.
Yeah, we are basically looking at a near disaster. The physical limitations of this specific hull, combined with some brutal weather conditions and geographical errors, forced a radical reorganization of human society, right on the fly.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the ship itself, because the Mayflower was never actually designed to carry passengers.
No, it was a 180-ton cargo ship.
Roughly 100 feet long, right?
Give or take, yeah. Built sometime before 1609, so it was already an aging vessel by the time 1620 rolled around.
Right, it had seen some miles.
Exactly. For over a decade, it had been hauling heavy cargo. We're talking vinegar, salt, hops, and especially French wine and cognac to London, and then turning around and taking English woolens up to Norway.
And it was commanded by Christopher Jones, right? A mariner from Harwich, who was also a part owner.
Yeah, which is an important detail, because that meant Master Jones was not some grand colonial explorer financed by a monarch.
Wasn't Magellan.
Right. He was a working-class merchant navigating the Jacobean economy. His livelihood depended entirely on keeping that specific wooden hull intact and profitable.
But that brings up the obvious question. A colonial expedition requires moving families, livestock, delicate supplies across the Atlantic. Why on earth would you choose an aging wine freighter for that job?
It seems counterintuitive, I know.
Yeah, you would think you'd want a nimble, fast galleon or something specifically built for long-distance exploration.
Well, what's fascinating here is that a lighter, faster ship might have actually killed them.
Wait, really?
Yeah. The Mayflower's history as a heavy hauler was precisely the thing that saved the expedition. It was what we call a square rigger.
Okay, break that down for us.
So in maritime architecture, that basically means the primary sails are supported on horizontal spars that run perpendicular to the keel of the ship.
Meaning the sails just, hang straight across the ship, acting almost like giant parachutes catching the wind from behind.
Precisely. And because of that design, square riggers were notoriously slow, and they were terrible at sailing close to the wind.
Let's clarify what sailing close to the wind actually means in practice, just so everyone is on the same page.
Sure. It means trying to sail at an upward angle against the direction the wind is blowing.
Right.
Like a modern sailboat uses the physics of lift, much like an airplane wing, to pull itself forward even when the wind is coming from the front quarters. But a 17th century square rigger couldn't really do that.
It mostly just had to be pushed from behind.
Exactly. If the wind was against you, you either zigzagged incredibly slowly, or you just dropped anchor and waited.
That sounds incredibly frustrating.
Oh, it was. But the trade-off for that lack of speed and maneuverability was profound stability. It had a broad, heavy, deep hull. And remember Christopher Jones?
Right, the captain.
He had spent years handling heavy, shifting liquid cargo in the unpredictable, violent waters of the North Sea. So he knew exactly how to manage a cumbersome, heavy ship in terrible weather.
Okay, so the U-Haul truck wasn't just a budget option. It was basically the armored tank they desperately needed for the North Atlantic.
That's a great way to put it.
And they absolutely needed it because The Mayflower was actually never supposed to make this crossing alone.
No, the entire famous departure narrative we have today was actually a massive last-minute fallback plan.
Right, the original logistical strategy made a lot more sense. The Separatists had purchased a secondary, much smaller vessel, a 60-ton ship called the Speedwell.
Yeah, the idea was for the Speedwell to cross the Atlantic alongside the Mayflower.
And once they arrived, the Mayflower would drop them off and return to England, right?
Exactly. While the Speedwell would stay in the New World, it would serve as a permanent fishing and trading vessel to, sustain the coastal settlement.
Which makes sense. You need a local shallow draft vessel to explore inlets, trade with indigenous populations, and actually catch fish.
Right. A massive, deep-keeled cargo ship like the Mayflower can't navigate coastal shallows safely without running aground.
But the Speedwell was basically an absolute disaster. I mean, they set sail from England, and almost immediately it started leaking.
Like a sieve.
Yeah. So they turned back, patched it up, and tried again. And they made it about 300 miles out past Land's End, like well into the open ocean.
And the Speedwell was taking on so much water, the crew genuinely thought it was going to sink.
So they had to turn around again, limp back to port, and just completely abandon the smaller ship.
Which is where things get really interesting from a historical perspective.
Yeah.
Because William Bradford, who was one of the Separatist leaders, he later recorded his strong suspicion that the Speedwell crew actively sabotaged their own vessel.
Wait, sabotage, like on purpose?
Yeah. The modern historical consensus actually points toward a mechanism called overmasting.
Okay, explain how putting a mast on a ship becomes sabotage. Because that just sounds like building a ship.
I know, it sounds weird. But it comes down to leverage. The crew may have intentionally installed masts that were too tall and sails that were too large for the ship's little 60-ton hull.
Oh, I see.
So when the wind hit those oversized sails, it created an enormous amount of torque at the base of the mast, acting like a giant lever.
Wow.
And that leverage actively pried the wooden planks of the hull apart while they were under sail, literally letting the water pour in. But as soon as they lowered the sails and stopped the leverage, the leaking stopped.
That is wild. And Bradford believed they rigged the ship this way on purpose just to avoid their contracts.
Yeah, they were terrified of starving to death in the unmapped wilderness of North America. So they allegedly engineered a mechanical failure that forced the leaders to leave the ship and the crew behind.
Well, whether it was intentional sabotage or just, profound incompetence at the shipyard, the mechanical failure of the Speedwell triggered a catastrophic logistical domino effect.
Really did.
Because suddenly you have 102 passengers. And this isn't just a unified religious group either.
No, it's a huge mix of people.
Right. You have the religious separatists who called themselves the saints, but you also have secular individuals, hired hands, coopers, soldiers, and merchants whom the separatists referred to as the strangers.
Right.
Add 30 to 40 crew members, and you cram all of them onto the Mayflower. And because of the false starts with the Speedwell, they don't actually depart England until September 6, 1620.
Which is incredibly late in the season,
Yeah.
meaning they sailed straight into the teeth of the North Atlantic storm season.
They were months behind schedule.
Yeah, and the ocean in the autumn is violently different from the ocean in the summer.
Just try to picture this. It's like an airline canceling your flight, forcing you onto an already overbooked plane, except this flight lasts 66 days.
And you're trapped below deck in a space roughly 5 feet high.
Right. There's no ventilation. People are suffering from severe scurvy. You're sharing this cramped, damp wooden box with 100 other terrified people. And the storms are just relentless.
It gets so violent that mid-ocean, the rolling of the ship caused a massive main structural beam to physically crack.
Which is terrifying. A main beam cracking on a wooden ship in the middle of the Atlantic is usually a death sentence, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The structural integrity of the hull relies entirely on the tension and pressure of those beams holding the frame together against the crushing weight of the water outside.
And they didn't have a shipyard to pull into. They had to force this massive piece of oak back into place while the ship was literally pitching in the waves.
Yeah.
And they repaired it using a giant iron screw. The surviving accounts suggest this was likely a component from a passenger's printing press, or possibly a house-raising jack.
Right. So a mechanical jack relies on a threaded screw to translate rotational force into immense linear thrust.
So they wedged this jack beneath the cracked beam and just slowly cranked it.
Exactly. Applying thousands of pounds of upward pressure to force the broken timber back into its original position, and then securing it with an upright post.
That's incredible.
They repurposed terrestrial technology, something meant for lifting a cottage roof or pressing ink onto paper, just to save the structural integrity of a ship.
Well, that mechanical repair kept the ship from imploding, but the weather had already done its damage. The violent winds blew them hundreds of miles off course. So on November 11, 1620, the ship finally drops anchor at Cape Cod, near modern-day Provincetown.
And the geography here is what triggered an immediate political crisis.
Because their charter, right, their legal permission to exist and build a colony was issued by the Virginia Company. But Cape Cod was far north of the Virginia Company's territory.
Right. 17th century corporate patents functioned strictly by latitude. A charter wasn't just a permission slip. It was the entire legal framework that bound the colonists to English law and to each other. So when they anchored outside the geographical boundaries of that specific document, the legal authority of the charter just evaporated.
Which means they were effectively in a state of nature. And the secular passengers, the strangers, immediately realized this, right?
They did.
They started making mutinous speeches, arguing that since the Virginia Company patent was void, nobody on that ship had the legal power to command them. They could just walk off into the woods and take their chances on their own.
Yeah, total breakdown of order. So to prevent the entire expedition from shattering into anarchy before they even stepped onto the beach, 41 adult men on the ship drafted and signed a document.
The Mayflower Compact.
Exactly. They agreed to form a civil body politic with just and equal laws.
I find this situation so fascinating from a human psychology standpoint. Because you are starving, you are freezing, half the people below deck are deathly ill.
Yeah.
And yet, before anyone is allowed to go ashore and find food or build a fire, you stop to draft what is essentially a neighborhood bylaws document. It feels like forming a homeowners association while your actual house is actively burning down.
It does sound crazy, but the drafting of that document was an act of pure survival. The leadership completely understood that physical survival in a hostile environment was dependent on social cohesion.
Right, if the group fractured, everyone dies.
Precisely. If the strangers took off on their own or hoarded supplies, it is over. They had to manufacture a new legal reality out of thin air.
They still acknowledged King James in the text of the document, but the actual day-to-day power, the authority to make laws and elect leaders, was suddenly coming from the mutual consent of the people standing in that room.
Which represents a staggering shift in Western governance. And historians are pretty split on how to categorize it today. Well, some view the compact as a direct philosophical precursor to the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, but others argue that the separatists in 1620 had entirely different, much more insular goals than the founders in 1776.
Right, they weren't trying to build a modern democracy.
Exactly, so they shouldn't be viewed through a modern democratic lens. But regardless of where you stand on that debate, the Mayflower Compact stands as an unprecedented experiment. It was a functioning government based on mutual consent, born entirely out of the terror of landing in the wrong place.
And the terror was really just beginning, because the laws couldn't protect them from the New England winter.
No, they couldn't.
Because they arrived so late, they had no time to build adequate shelter on shore. So that aging, battered wine ship had to become a floating hospital.
Yeah. The physical toll of the 66-day crossing, combined with freezing temperatures and severe malnutrition, it just created a horrific biological environment below deck.
They called it the Great Sickness. It was this devastating combination of scurvy, pneumonia, and tuberculosis. And it wiped out exactly half the passengers.
And it devastated the crew just as badly. Half the sailors died, including the gunner, the boatswain, and 3 quartermasters.
You literally have a ship that is slowly turning into a graveyard.
It's incredibly bleak. But when spring finally arrived, the survivors permanently moved ashore. And this is when they encounter the Wampanoag people, leading to the crucial alliance with Chief Massasoit, and eventually the famous 1621 3-day harvest feast.
And this is where we really need to look at the indigenous historical accounts, specifically the context provided by the Plymouth 400 exhibit, because the traditional story we're told treats the Wampanoag as if they were discovering Europeans for the very first time.
Right.
But they weren't. They were intimately and tragically familiar with them.
Yes. The geopolitical landscape of New England in 1620 was already heavily shaped by previous European incursions.
Give us the timeline on that.
Sure. So in 1614, which is 6 years before the Mayflower dropped anchor, an English explorer named Thomas Hunt kidnapped 20 Wampanoag men from Patuxet.
And Patuxet is the exact plot of land where Plymouth was founded, right?
Exactly. He also kidnapped 7 men from Nauset on Cape Cod, packed them into his ship, and sailed to Spain to sell them into slavery.
Just horrific. And one of the only men known to have made it back across the Atlantic was Tisquantum, the man history remembers as Squanto.
Right. So when the surviving Pilgrims interact with the Wampanoag in 1621, Massasoit isn't just greeting strangers out of simple curiosity. His people have suffered devastating European kidnappings, and they have been decimated by diseases brought by earlier traders.
Right, he's calculating.
Yes, he is making a highly calculated strategic diplomatic choice to ally with these new, heavily armed arrivals.
We grow up picturing this 1621 feast as a friendly cross-cultural potluck. But the reality is you have desperate religious refugees who just spent the winter watching half their families suffocate from pneumonia on a freezing cargo ship.
Yeah.
And sitting across from them are Wampanoag leaders navigating the profound trauma of lost populations and kidnapped citizens. This was a high-stakes diplomatic summit between two groups of people dealing with unimaginable tragedy.
That's perfectly stated. If we connect this to the bigger picture, that alliance ensured the physical survival of the Plymouth colony. Without the agricultural knowledge of the Wampanoag and without the political protection of Massasoit, the remaining 50 colonists would have perished.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, this successful settlement initiated a prolonged era of land loss and cultural displacement for native populations, which ultimately culminated in devastating conflicts like King Philip's War later in the century.
Right.
So the survival of one group was inherently tied to the beginning of immense loss for another.
And it all hinged on the structural integrity of that one battered cargo ship.
It really did.
But once the colony was stable enough, in April 1621, Captain Christopher Jones finally set sail back to London.
And the ship was empty at this point. It was ballasted only by heavy stones gathered from the Plymouth shore.
But the return trip was drastically different. Because he was riding the strong westerly winds that push across the North Atlantic toward Europe, he made it back in less than half the time it took to cross.
Yeah, much faster. But the grueling winter in that floating hospital had utterly destroyed his health.
Yeah, Christopher Jones died less than a year later, in March 1622.
Leaving the Mayflower without its master and without the primary advocate who had kept it running for over a decade.
So what happens to the ship? By 1624, it ends up in probate court to be appraised for his widow. And the official Latin document from the court describes the vessel as in ruinis, in ruins.
Yeah, completely worn out.
The sellable items on board, like the rigging, the anchors, the wood, they were valued at a paltry 128 pounds and 5 shillings.
Which is roughly, what, 26,000 pounds today?
Yeah, about that. So the ship itself was sold and almost certainly broken up for scrap wood in Rotherhithe along the River Thames.
Just think about that. The oak timbers that had crossed the Atlantic and housed the birth of a new political framework were just recycled back into barns or smaller boats in the English economy.
The physical Mayflower just vanished into the mud. But the archetype of the ship evolved in ways that those 17th century merchants could never have predicted.
Oh, definitely.
I mean, in 1957, a full-scale replica, the Mayflower II, was built in England, sailed across the Atlantic, and now sits as a floating classroom in Massachusetts. But the legacy takes a massive technological leap forward for the 400th anniversary of the Voyage.
Right, the launch of the Mayflower autonomous ship, or MAS 400.
IBM and a marine research organization called ProMare built an entirely new vessel to bear the name. But this wasn't a heavy oak square rigger.
No, completely different. It was a solar-powered trimaran navigated completely by artificial intelligence.
Wait, okay, a trimaran.
Yeah, so trimaran features a main center hull flanked by 2 smaller outrigger hulls.
Oh.
And this specific design drastically reduces hydrodynamic drag, allowing it to move efficiently while providing immense lateral stability in rough seas. So it doesn't need to push through the water like Christopher Jones's cargo ship.
Right.
It literally glides over it.
And in 2022, this AI-piloted ship successfully crossed the Atlantic. There were 0 humans on board.
None.
Instead of a captain looking at the stars with an astrolabe and, dropping a lead weight on a rope to check the water depth, the AI captain used 6 AI-powered cameras, more than 30 sensors, and deep learning algorithms to dodge weather and maritime traffic.
It's amazing.
And it was out there collecting critical marine data on microplastics, global warming, and ocean acidification. So what does this all mean?
The contrast is striking. The engineers deliberately chose the name Mayflower because it represents the ultimate archetype of crossing into the unknown. The 1620 voyage was about humans confronting the physical limits of the unmapped globe.
Right.
But the MAS 400 is about technology confronting the limits of our environmental data.
So we have a direct evolutionary line from the rotting oak timbers of a 1624 wine freighter to the sleek, solar-powered aluminum of an artificial intelligence vessel.
Yeah.
It shifted from a ship transporting fragile human bodies to build a settlement to a robotic ship transporting digital data to preserve the ocean itself. I mean, it proves that human progress constantly relies on repurposing things.
Definitely.
Christopher Jones repurposed a North Sea hauler to cross the Atlantic. The passengers repurposed a mechanical jack to fix a shattered beam. The colonists repurposed corporate patent law to invent consensual government.
Right. The Mayflower proves that history is rarely a clean blueprint. It is a messy, reactive process of dealing with immediate crises, using whatever tools you happen to have lying around.
It really changes how you look at the entire founding narrative. We're looking at a blue-collar, heavily abused U-haul of a ship. It was supposed to have a companion vessel, but it didn't. It cracked its main beam. It missed its destination by hundreds of miles, legally invalidating its own existence.
Yeah, literally one disaster after another.
And yet, that exact sequence of disasters accidentally laid the foundation for American democracy.
Which leaves you with one final, lingering question to ponder long after you finish listening.
Let's hear it.
Knowing the incredibly fragile chain of events that led to the drafting of the Mayflower Compact in that freezing harbor, if the Speedwell hadn't leaked and the Mayflower had actually landed in Virginia exactly as planned, peacefully governed by their original corporate charter, would the concept of consensual democratic self-governance in America have ever been born?
Wow.
Or was the birth of American democracy entirely dependent on a 17th century navigational failure?
It's incredible to realize how much of our history relies on a broken mast and a bad map. Something to think about. Keep diving deep, and we'll catch you on the next one.